why don't we go ahead and do a little bit of a getting started without, and we'll turn it over to one of the Allens. um,
We'll do
so
a coin flip.
by way of introduction, let's see. So um, I will tell you all what I told Alan Stanton when we talked a little bit about how did this all come to be. Um, about a year and a half ago, a colleague of mine from Minnesota, John Anderson, was a Lutheran bishop and now is at Luther Seminary, and they're doing a lot of work with rural churches, which was John's specialty when he was the bishop of the Southwest Synod. And he's been a very close colleague and been a real good source of information. And so he posted, I think, something in Faith Plus Lead in their website about this book and about Alan Stanton coming to talk with students at the seminary. And I take John at his word. If he says something's good, it's good. So I went and grabbed the book, and it's good. And then I saw that Alan Harris over in Ohio was, I think, on a vacation or a sabbatical, and took a picture of the cover of the book and said, "This is a great book." So I popped a note to Alan Harris and said, "Hey, would you want to do a joint study? And by the way, the author's from Tennessee. Maybe we could ask Crystal Williams from Tennessee if she'd like to join us." So that's how this whole thing came into being. It's just a little here, little this and a little that, with a sprinkling of maybe it's time for the regional churches to do things together rather than separately. So we did that, yeah. And then along the way, we had a regional ministers retreat for the Heartland area. And Paul Koch, who's one of the regional ministers in Mid-America or Missouri, said, "Hey, Ron Rutledge has a network of rural churches and rural ministers that he's trying to get started." So another add-on to the conversation. So we decided, let's do these conversations on Monday nights in October, in the fall. And Alan said, "Hey, I happen to know how to get a hold of Alan Stanton. You want me to see if he could join us?" And so that's how we're here. We got lucky. Alan said yes, he would be willing to join us. And then Alan Harris, Crystal Williams, and I kind of tried to organize the next 4 Mondays around themes. So now let me back up and tell you the name of the book that Alan Stanton wrote is Reclaiming Rural. Rebuilding Thriving Rural Congregations. And after reading it, we realized everything he said about rural communities could be said about neighborhoods in urban settings and different suburbs of different cities and ex-urban. So we figured, let's just make this thing open as possible. So it's really, we're calling this Monday Night Conversations about Church Vitality. And we're going to use Reclaiming Rural as the lens through which we will take a look at these different themes. And the fifth Monday of October, we will finally turn our attention to the question of what is vitality? So we will let you know more about the themes each week. But at this point, there are 25 people registered. We continue to promote this. We imagine there'll be more people. You may even, if you feel so inclined, may want to share this with colleagues and friends from wherever. They don't have to be in your county or even your region. So, Alan Harris, let me pause there and see if there's anything you'd like to add to.
Well, I would just say that the impetus for this came from 2 conversations I had a couple of weeks apart from small membership congregations. One kind of suburban and one rural, and both of them just kind of pleading, don't let the regional church ignore our churches. I'm known for being a kind of an urban pastor. I've had churches in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Cleveland. And so it kind of struck my heart. And it's like, oh, of course, I have no desire to leave anyone out. So I just thought, let's find something that would focus me and my energy around rural churches, which I don't know as much about. And that's when someone referred Alan's book to me. And it really did help me get my mind wrapped around a different way of looking at congregations. You know, it really, like you said, Chris, it was both, I saw some unique aspects of rural congregations that I'd not thought of, and many similarities with every congregation I've been associated with. So it's kind of a little bit of both of those things. So I come as an honest learner to help support all my congregations, and this is one way I can help do that. So thanks for helping make this happen.
So these really are going to be intended to be conversations, although tonight we're going to mostly be listening to Alan since he wrote the book. It seems to me like we probably want to hear some further insights and reflections. Maybe you have not had a chance to read the book, so he'll hit some of the highlights. But as we go through these next 4 Monday nights after tonight, it'll be more conversation. We'll be asking questions, and we'll layer in some insights and some additional information along the way. But for the most part, it'll be you all talking with each other. So please know we're looking to hear your wisdom and your experience. I'm unlike Alan. Almost every church I've served has been rural, and well, the most rural was the largest church. It worshipped 120, but every other church since then have been small churches. So this is part of my own experience. So with that, is it okay if we turn to you, Alan Stanton?
And should we just make mention about why Crystal might not be on?
Oh, that's probably not a bad idea. Crystal is on her way home from Greece. She has planned for a long time now. She put together a hosted trip where she was showing people kind of the travels of Paul. So she texted this morning and said, "Hey, can one of you send me the link so that when I land, I can join you?" So she's going to land someplace here in the next hour or two, and she'll join us when she can. But looking forward to her presence with us. She is a delight and terribly bright. So we'll offer a lot to this conversation as we go along. Alan, I don't really know much about you other than what the book tells me, which is that you were the director of a center on rural life at a private college in Tennessee that merged with the University of Tennessee, and now you're at the School of Health, Public Health, but the School of Dentistry at the University of Tennessee, doing a lot of work with rural communities and dental care.
Yeah.
So that's about as good of an introduction I can do. I'm sorry for that, but
no, you were very kind.
Yeah.
So yeah, my name's Alan. Nice to meet everybody. Like Chris said, I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church. And my full-time job, I'm appointed to a public policy project in the College of Dentistry at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. And I'm not really sure how I ended up working in a College of Dentistry as a theologian, but here we are. That's what happens when God calls you places. You just sort of nod and go along, and the rest makes sense. I also have what I joke is a part-time job at the University of the Ozarks, which is a small private college in Clarksville, Arkansas, where I am a consulting fellow there for their Center for Rural Ministry. So actually tomorrow I'm going to head out to Arkansas for 3 days working with rural pastors. And so that's one of my fun things that I get to do is work with churches and pastors through that work, which is a nice outlet for me. So my career makes no sense, and I've never tried to make sense of it. And I'll just kind of keep doing that until maybe one day it will. All right. So I'm gonna share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. I'm gonna ask you all to weigh in sometimes, and you can do that. The easiest way I found is kind of through the comments. This either goes really, really well or really, really poorly. So if at some point it stops going well, we'll shift gears and do something else, because I am nothing if not flexible. Some people really hate the audience participation. Some people really like it. So we'll see what you guys all enjoy doing. But I'll have some questions for you throughout the night. And at the end, we'll have some conversation. Or if you have a question in the chat at any point, just type it up, and I'll stop every now and then and kind of check that to make sure that everybody's with me. And if I say something and you're like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, you can say that, because I say a lot of dumb things. Despite what Alan and Chris say, there's a lot of dumb things that I float around in my head. So with that, I'll pull up this PowerPoint and we'll get started. I'm also sorry if you hear something kind of weird. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old at home. So I'm still in my office in the College of Dentistry, and I think only like a few dentists are here and the janitor. So I've never been here this late. So we'll find out what happens after night in the College of Dentistry. All right. So here is I wanted to basically just talk about. So first, can everybody see the screen? Y'all good? PowerPoint? Great.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a lot about the unique gifts of the rural church. And by a show of hand, so that I make sure I don't leave anyone out, who here considers themselves to be in a rural appointment or a rural congregation or a rural setting? All right, so just about everyone. All right. Great. That makes this easier on me. So here's my proposal to you that we're going to sort of base tonight's conversation from, and that I would challenge you over the next several weeks to kind of start from this idea. And that is this, that all of the indicators of success that small rural churches have been given are not designed for small rural congregations, because they do not understand small rural congregations. So one of the reasons I wrote this book was I got really frustrated as a rural pastor. Previously, I served as a rural pastor in North Carolina, where I'm from. And I was always really frustrated because somebody said they can't see my screen. Can y'all see it? Okay, cool. So I got really frustrated because every time we would talk about rural churches, we would talk about them as if they either couldn't be vital or hadn't achieved vitality yet, or there's no option for them ever to be vital, or they're all declining and decaying, or just some sort of like, inaccurate way of describing rural congregations. And it was really, it was really disheartening for me, because I was a young pastor. I loved my church, and I saw a lot of opportunity in my congregations. But I was always frustrated, like, why other people didn't see them. And so as I started digging into it, I realized we don't know how to talk about rural communities, number one. And so we can't even talk about like what it means to be a vital congregation. And here's my classic example of this. So about a decade ago now, actually more than a decade ago now, my denomination, the United Methodist Church, came out with this study called the Towers-Watson Report. And we voted on this at our big general conference. And it was a study to see how we should adopt a blanket understanding of what it meant to be a vital congregation. And there's some qualitative and quantitative research methodology that they did not do very well in it. But they basically came out with these 4 areas, right? So, and they said every vital rural congregation in the world has these same 4 things in common. So the first one is they have multiple small groups with more small groups and more programs for youth and children. They have a high percentage of effective lay leadership. They have worship services with a mix of traditional and contemporary services alongside topical preaching, and then pastors who hold longer tenures and who excel at generative leadership. And on the surface, I don't really have a problem with most of these, right? Effective lay leadership, I think small rural churches, we're great at that. In fact, every study tells us that small membership rural congregations have more lay involvement than urban congregations. And that's because like we don't exist with a staff, right? In our small membership churches, it's the pastor and people who are willing to do work. I think worship service should be contextual, right? Like your worship and preaching should preach to the community that you're in. There's an excellent book called Preaching as a Local Folk Art and Tradition, where Lenore Tubbs Tisdale talks about, we need to be really understanding our community and thinking about homiletics and thinking about preaching as an art that speaks to this local tradition, a local folk art. And I think that's right. I think that's right on the nose, right? Like you don't preach the same as you do in the mountains of North Carolina as you do in New York City. They're just very different cultures. So why would our preaching be the same? I would love for rural congregations to have longer tenures, at least in my denomination, people start out in rural congregations and they get moved after about 3 or 4 years, right? They show promise in those places, and then they're like, all right, well, you're out of here because you had somewhere else we wanted you to serve in a different place. The first one, I will say, really grinds my gears a lot because it makes no statistical sense, right? They say that every vital congregation, whether you're large or small, had more small groups and then small groups for youth and children. So I'll do the first part of this first, the small groups, the number of small groups first, and then we'll talk about the youth and children. Anyone want to guess what the number of differences? So the way they did this, let me back up. The way they measured this, right, was they would say highly vital churches have this many small groups, and they would say like highly vital large churches, highly vital small membership churches, and then they would say like not vital churches and large churches, medium churches, not vital small churches have this many small groups. Anyone want to guess how many, like the difference between the number of small groups in a highly vital small membership church and a non-vital small membership church? Just throw it out in the comments if you have a number that you want to guess. Okay, 5. Anybody else? 2. All right. A small group is 8 to 10. A small group is like a Bible study or a peer group or any kind of smaller group that meets outside of the normal worship service. So it can be anything from an accountability group to a Bible study to like the youth group would count as a small group in a lot of places. 8 to 10 is Alan's guess. Many of our small groups are, yeah, 3. That's the best answer I've heard tonight. Paul says many of our churches are small groups. That is exactly right. The difference, so a highly vital small membership church had 5.1 small groups in this study, and a non-vital small membership church had 4.5 small groups. So the difference was, what is that, 0.6? If you can explain to me how to have 0.6 of a small group, please let me know. I would like to co-author a book with you. We'll go on a speaking circuit, and we'll really do something good, I hope, or at least get paid for it, right? So let me know if you can figure that out. It's just, it's meaningless, right? It's a meaningless metric. But we have taken this and said, like, this is absolutely true because we saw this in a couple of large churches, and large churches that do small groups have a better chance of getting more people involved, right? But like Paul pointed out, a lot of small churches are just small groups. In fact, there's a whole study about Carl Dudley wrote this great book back in 2000, 2001 about small church leadership. And what he wrote about was, sociologically speaking, a lot of small churches are just single-celled organisms, right? Like large churches, people come to the worship service, but they're really engaging through the church, through choir, through small groups, through volunteer groups, through, the knitting club, whatever it is. In small membership churches, you come to worship, and that's the church, right? Like you might have a choir, but really, people and things are decided in the worship service. I remember guest preaching at a church one time where they had their business meeting during the announcements, right? It was 15 of us sitting in a church. It's the only time we're all going to be together. So let's decide, how we're going to fix the stairs out front in the announcements. The other thing that kind of grinds my gear about this is this more youth and children part, right? Because we've internalized this truth, this wisdom that healthier churches have younger people, and that if we want to be a vital church, we have to be catering to younger crowds. Now, I have worked with youth in my last stop in rural Tennessee, in Pulaski. I volunteered as the youth pastor, right? I love working with youth. But a lot of our rural communities are growing, and they're growing because they're attracting recent retirees. And I have a friend who pastors in the mountains of North Carolina. There's this group of people there, we call them halfbacks. So they started in New York and they moved to Florida, and they found out Florida was too hot for them. So they moved halfway back into the mountains of North Carolina. And they're usually fairly wealthy retirees, right, that are moving in. They have lots of free time. They want to be engaged in the community. They want to volunteer places. They have lots of expertise. They have high disposable incomes. And the denomination says to them, we want you to focus on youth. And so in his particular community, the youth, like the under 18 population, has grown by, I think, like 0.3% over the last decade. The above 65 crowd has grown by like 35% from in-migration alone, right? And there's a really big question to have, aside from all those things about like they have more money to give, can you really be incarnational if you're ignoring the people of your community? And if your community is aging, can you be a vital church if you're ignoring the people around you that you're called to serve, that you're called to be a part of? And I would say no, you really can't. So when we think about, small membership churches and rural churches, I don't think there's an easy silver bullet to say, here are the exact metrics that you have to have. And I don't think we really know how to talk about how to establish those metrics, because I don't think we know how to talk about what it means to be a rural community. So here's my next question, and I'm going to invite you to just kind of put a sentence or two in the chat if you want. How do you know when you're in a rural place? If you had to, identify what it meant to be rural, how would you identify that? Cornfields, traffic, the language used. Oh, I like that one. I haven't heard that one before. The size of the community away from larger communities. All right. One stoplight. Okay, so the last town I lived in, they didn't want to be a one stoplight town. So they put stoplights at every intersection through the middle of the square. So we had like 8 stoplights within a 1 mile radius. It was so annoying. So you would turn and go around the stoplight, and then you hit the 4-way stops instead. Distance from the nearest city center. You don't have to use your turn signal because everyone knows you're going. That's true. Yeah. Usually this is the first group I've ever had that didn't say cows. That's usually when I get that somebody always says there's a lot of cows. Go figure. So we have a pretty easy definition of saying what is and what is not urban, right? If you are in a place that has more than 50,000 people, you are considered to be an urban core, a metropolitan area. They tried to actually raise that to 75,000, and I have opinions about that, but that's a soapbox for another day. There is no standard definition for what it means to be a rural community. The federal government has 11 definitions. 15 definitions. 11 of those are in the USDA alone. Every state has its own definition of rural. Every nonprofit that works in rural places has a definition of rural. The United Methodist Church has a definition of rural. None of them really make a lot of sense for all of what rural communities are, right? Because, there are some places that, yeah, corn is a major thing. If you're in Iowa, you're going to see a lot of cornfields, right? If you're in a rural part of Tennessee, you might not see as much corn because there's primarily a manufacturing area. You might have a rural town that has one high school and one elementary school. You might have a rural town that has, 5 elementary schools. It just kind of depends. So we define a lot of rural places as what they're not. And then this ability, like they're not heavily populated, right? They're not wealthy. They're not this, that. And so we say like all these different things about what rural places are. And what it leads to is this sort of flattening of the story. And I like to argue that we tend to take rural places into one of 2 stories. And the first one is, I'm having tech issues now, so sorry about this. All right, let's see if I can get this back up. There we go. All right. The first one is what I like to call the agrarian paradise. We talk about rural places, right, as if they're these really wonderful, down to earth places where everybody's at one with nature, and there's like, you know, sheep, and you can go feed the sheep, and you can go ride and pet the horses, and you know, and some of that's true. Like so we moved to Memphis back in February, and it's the first city I've lived in, and I'm having a little bit of a hard time adjusting because I've never been a city person. And in our rural community, I actually had a friend who had a farm, and I would take my daughters out to her farm to ride her horses, right? So she would go out there, she would pet the goats, and then we'd ride horses, and then, you know, it was great. We would also sometimes go to Brentwood because my donor, Brentwood's like a suburb of Nashville, Tennessee. He had chickens. So, I mean, I didn't have to go to a rural area to go play with chickens. I could go up to the middle of a major suburb. So there's some truth to this, but it also can kind of flatten it, right? Because what we end up talking about is only the good things in rural. So we talk a lot about virtue and values, and everybody's nice to each other, and everybody cares about each other. And there's some truth to this, right? This isn't a new narrative. This goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson actually used this during the independence. So he would say like the rural Americans were everything the British aristocracy were not, right? They were hardworking people. They weren't fancy. They were humble. They owned a stake of the earth, or like some of them owned a stake of the earth, of the country, and like they were willing to work. And you know, it was everything that those British people were not. So Thomas Jefferson used this as a way to like, you know, galvanize the troops, kind of. A couple years ago, David Brooks wrote this piece called "What Rural America Has to Teach Us," right? And he talks about how you can drive around this community, and you know, you can leave your keys in the trunk of your car unlocked, and no one's going to steal it. And in my last town, you know what, in every town I've ever lived in that was rural, I would not leave the keys of my car in there, right? Like I would just, no, because there's a lot of rural places. Like there are some rural places where, yeah, absolutely. There's some rural places where it was funny, you know, we moved to Memphis, and everyone asked me what we were going to do about crime and how we felt about the crime in Memphis. And I said, well, you know, my first week in Pulaski at 3 a.m. I woke up because like this meth head was banging on my door in the middle of the night. So I mean, like crime exists in rural places. It's not unheard of. Probably wouldn't leave my keys in the car in Pulaski either, you know? Um, so and then part of this too is like we talk about all this kind of gets flattened out to like farm life, right? Like farm life inculcates these things. Farm life does this. Farm life makes us more virtuous. And so a lot of times what you hear is rural equals agrarian, and rural places are only farm places. So here's my next poll question to you. Ready? If you had to guess the percentage, and if you've read my book, you don't get to participate. I'm hopeful that most of you have not, because generally most people have not. Um, what percentage of rural counties in the United States do you think um, are dependent upon agriculture for their economies? You can type it in the chat. 80%? 40%, 60%? Anyone else have a guess? 90%. Wow.
She's not a crook.
All right, so it's actually about 30%
Look at trends.
of all counties in the US. So I'll show you this map here. And depending on where you live, this will kind of color your expectation, right? So this first one are the farming dependent counties. Let me get my nice little laser pointer here. So up here you have the farming dependent counties, and you can see they're kind of spread throughout the Midwest. Somebody always asks me this question, so I'll go ahead and clarify. The way they just define economically dependent is if at least, I think it's 25% of your economy is dependent upon this particular area. So here, this is, and you know, as you can see, it's the middle of the country. These are manufacturing dependent areas, and you can kind of see they're geared towards the east, and particularly heavy down here in the southeast and up here in the Ohio and Indiana area. So Tennessee, where I previously lived, right here is heavily all manufacturing, right? where I grew up in North Carolina, mostly manufacturing. These are mining dependent, so you can see a lot in Texas and Appalachia, out in Nevada. Sorry, I'm getting over some pneumonia here. So, and then over here in these are recreation counties, and this is actually one of the growing segments of rural economies. So these are places where people go for tourism. So you can see like the mountains in North Carolina, people like to go there to go to the lakes and go to the mountains. Down in Texas, California, like, you know, Lake Tahoe, obviously, right? Like these are places we want to vacation. So the interesting thing is that, you know, rural places are pretty diverse, right? They're not all farming cultures. They're not all farming communities. They're actually a wide variety. And so this, let me just say too, this does not mean they're not farmers in your community. And this does not mean that there's not people who farm, right? So most farmers nowadays only like are hobby farmers. So there's plenty of people who have like micro farms, plenty of people who move to a rural place and like want to build a farm, but they're not doing like the kind of commercial economic farming that we would typically associate with, or that we assume that exists in rural places. This is one of my favorite graphs. I just think it's a lot of fun. It got me in a lot of trouble when we became part of the UT system though, because I had to go around to the UT Ag Institute and say this all the time, and they did not like that. So there are some good and bads about this narrative, right? So on the one hand, I think it presents rural communities in a pretty positive light. I like rural places for all the reasons that we talked about. I do think there's a sense of social connectedness, right? And studies have shown that people in rural places are more connected to their communities. There's more trust in those communities. There's more buy-in to social institutions like in civic clubs. So some stronger local community bonds, more community engagement. We care about our institutions. We want to preserve them, and that includes the church. So giving rates in rural areas are usually higher for rural churches than they are in urban areas, which is kind of cool. On the other hand, I think it makes the communities, like I've said, one-dimensional. It ignores a lot of the challenges, right? Because if they're so beautiful, like, do they even have challenges anymore? And I think one of the problems that we see in things like David Brooks's essay is that it commodifies these rural places. So there's rural, like his title was what rural America has to teach us, right? And so like us is distinctive from rural America. And you saw this a lot, I think, during COVID. You saw this a lot during COVID where people would leave urban places and they would go to rural communities and they would use up the healthcare system and buy the groceries. And it created a lot of disruptions because these places were not designed to have that many people visiting their hospitals, right? So it was safer to live in rural places. So we kind of got into this habit of saying like, all right, let's just go to the rural areas. So it kind of can create a commodification. And I hear a lot of people going to rural places and saying like, I would never live there, but man, I love to visit, right? That's the kind of attitude I think this particular narrative fosters. And it comes down to the church, like the way we talk about church. So these are some quotes I've heard, you know, as a pastor in my church and then other places. So, you know, on the one hand, I really like it when people go, we're a strong, really committed community. I think that's great. We're small, but we love big, or like anybody in this church will do anything for you. Those are great things. And when you move to a new community, I mean, as a young adult, like when I moved to a rural place, the first thing I do is go to church, right? Because that's where I want to meet people. That's really the place I'm going to make friends. And that has been true in every rural town I've ever lived in. On the flip side, you end up with these sort of,
I'll talk to you later.
I don't know, like people say they're nice, but you can't expect much out of them. Sort of like permission to not do a whole lot. I remember being told like, just go to this church and love these people, and that's all you have to do, as if you don't have expectations for what ministry is. Or my district superintendent, when I went to my first appointment, said, you know, once you hang out here for a few years and don't kill the church, we'll move you to a place where you can do real ministry. And I don't think he meant anything bad by it, but it was just interesting the language he used, right? Like, what is real ministry? And can you not do that in a rural community? All right. So the other narrative, before I move on, any questions, comments about this particular narrative? Cool. We'll press on. All right, so the other story that we like to tell is what I call the story of rural decay. So 2 points about this narrative, or about these images. So one of these, the first one is a screenshot from a headline that the New York Times ran a few years ago, "The Hard Truths of Trying to Save Rural Economies." People sent that to me in droves when it was published. So now I put it up here because I got tired of people sending it to me. So it became my go-to example of, please don't ever send me this article again. It uses a lot of data poorly to talk about how rural places are just doomed for failure and collapse. The second image, I literally just Googled rural one day, and this is one of the first images that came up on Google. So it too is now in my slide deck as this is what we talk about, right? In fact, all the images in these 3 slides, except for this screenshot where I just Googled rural one day, and that's what came up. I'm lazy like that. So this is J.D. Vance. I'm sorry for you people in Ohio. I'm not insulting his politics, just a terrible book. I also have opinions about his politics, but I'll save this for a private conversation. All right, so his book, he wrote this book called Hillbilly Elegy. It's a terrible book, y'all. Like, it's awful. So J.D. Vance wrote a book about a particular community in a particular area of Appalachia, right? And what happened was it got sort of extrapolated onto all of rural America after the 2016 election. And people were trying to say, we want to like understand what's happening in rural places. But his thesis on page 7, he spells it out, is he believes that rural places are about people reacting to bad circumstances in the worst way possible, and about a culture that increasingly encourages social decay instead of counteracting it. Like his argument is there's something fundamentally wrong with rural communities that's causing them to decline. And he tells this story in the book, and for the life of me, I can't figure it out, where he goes to Yale Law School, and he takes some of his friends to go eat at Cracker Barrel, right? Because he like loved Cracker Barrel as a kid. And his friends at Yale Law School all hated Cracker Barrel, which, like, first off, they're not your friends. If they hate Cracker Barrel, they're not your friends. Cracker Barrel's great. I love Cracker Barrel. Second of all, so he starts asking this question, like, well, what's different about them that they hate this? Like, they come from successful families, but they don't like this, and so it must be like my culture. And I don't really know how you go from like chicken and dumplings to my culture is terrible in that quick of a succession, but he did it, and then he got a lot of money out of it. But his argument became like, there's just a different culture that allows them to succeed. And so he takes all these values of like suburbia and urban America, where success is wealth, success is accumulation of something, and he makes that the definition of what it means to be successful. I don't know that that's really it, right? And I don't really know that people living in rural areas are trying to destroy that, right? There's not something inherently wrong with those rural people. But this is a narrative that, like the other one, has persisted for a long time. When you talk about, I one time went to my project manager or my program officer at my last job. She was right out of college, and I said, describe Appalachia for me. And so she closed her eyes and she was like, you know, those black and white photos, right? And it was all these pictures of the war on poverty. Like, when we talk about rural places, we still imagine poverty and people eating, you know, whatever, and it's weird. These are 50 years old now, or older. Yeah, older. This isn't an accurate perception of what's happening in rural places. And it actually ignores some of the data. So these are not the most recent ones I find, but like growing up in a rural place means that you're less likely to be incarcerated. There's a bunch of different reasons for that, but one of them is that because you have a stronger social network, that's going to keep you out of trouble. And also because, I'll put a finer point on this, if you know the cops, they're less likely to take you to jail. I got out of a few scrapes in high school that way. Some rural areas are better for economic mobility. And again, this goes down to really about the social network in rural places, right? And In rural places where you don't have nonprofits providing services, you're relying upon friends and family to help you out. And what we've seen is that that actually helps you move ahead in life. So kids, the way they did the study was like kids who were in poverty at risk in urban places, and they compared them to kids who were in poverty in rural places. And the kids who were in poverty in rural places had more opportunities for economic mobility, more opportunities to climb the economic ladder. So there's really great things about living in a rural place. Ever since 2014, the plurality of people, according to Gallup, have wanted to live in a small town or rural area. So every year they do this study, and every year it's pretty significant that people don't want to live in cities. And if they had their choice, they would live in a small town or a rural place. And there's a bunch of reasons I can get into later about like why people move to cities, but people like to also move back to rural communities for a lot of other good reasons. And we saw a huge spike in that following COVID, where people are going, why am I paying this much for a 1-bedroom apartment when I could literally own a house and do my remote work, right? If you have internet in your community. So again, there's some good and bad things. So on the one hand, I think like there's some needs in rural places. So like we need to talk about healthcare in rural America. Like that's why I have my job. We need to talk about education in rural America. We need to talk about infrastructure in rural America. There's real challenges in our communities. And so often, but not always, this question is framed like, how do we continue to support these communities? On the other hand, I think it leaves out a lot of the positives. So, and it can blame the culture, right? Like it can say these people are not worth doing anything. And that I think becomes something that's beloved across the political spectrum. And that's why it's inherently dangerous, because when I hear progressives talk about this, it's rural places are taking more money than they're putting in, but they're not voting for progressive policy. So why should we continue to support that? And conservatives are saying, well, if there's something inherently wrong with the social nature of these communities, why would we invest in these communities, right? Because investment's not going to fix it. So what it leads to on both ends of the spectrum is let's just not invest in rural places, which I think is probably not a good thing. And again, this seeps into the church. So on the one hand, I think we understand that rural places are a vital mission field and a viable mission field. I think deep down, we know that rural churches are not going to become large, so we can go ahead and remove that pressure from them. But then on the flip side of that, we say, well, they're not growing large, so they're dying, right? Because we have this sort of good to great mentality. If it's not growing, it's dying, right? Which I don't think is true. There's a word for in healthcare for something that grows without stopping, it's cancer. So it's not like you don't have a balanced ecosystem, right? If something is perpetually growing. And then it encourages clergy to look elsewhere for meaningful ministry. And that might be because they've been told that there's opportunities in urban places, or they really believe they're not going to have the opportunities in a rural community, or whatever it is. And so we just kind of put that in people's heads. I mean, I remember as a seminarian saying like, I'm going to go serve the rural church, and people are going like, you're going to kill your career. And thinking like, that's ridiculous, right? But we tell people that. All right. So I'm going to put up a slide, and I am curious, this is kind of highlights the difference between the way we look at our rural communities. So we interpret what it means to be successful through different ways. So in urban and suburban areas, you're going to look at success and vitality, or like as like accumulation and wealth and all these other things. In rural areas, you're going to look at success as something different. And there's a really fantastic book called Dividing Paradise, where Jennifer Sherman outlines this a little bit, where she talks about like in rural places, people are they're like, your social capital is about like your work ethic and your commitment and all these other like these really great things that we kind of carry, and like the commitment to the community, right? So when I was in high school, I was getting ready to go to college, and I got this piece of advice. I was debating between two colleges, and one of the colleges was going to be really expensive, and I was going to have to take out a lot of loans to go to it. But I thought like, it'll give me more opportunities for success later on. And the other college was a regional college that I had a full scholarship to, but I didn't know if like it didn't have quite the same name recognition, right? So I was talking to my aunt in my book, I said it was a family friend, but it was my aunt, it was my great aunt, and loved her to death. And she gave me this piece of advice. She said, if you go to a fancy school, you're going to wind up in a lot of debt. You're going to get too big for your britches. And then plenty of people go to the regional school and they turn out fine. Go there, you come home, you get a good job. You won't forget who you are because you'll be home. So I am curious, just in the chat, do you think this was good advice or bad advice? Just drop it on in. Good or bad? You're not allowed to say it depends. Somebody always tries to say that. I forbid you. Good, good, bad. I got 2 bads, 2 goods, 3 goods. Bad. Anybody else want to weigh in? Good. So depends on the person. It's always one rule breaker. Good. Go where you can finish. That's really good advice. So when I told this story to people in my college, my friends in college, I ended up going to the more expensive school, and they would all say, they came from very different backgrounds as me, and they would all say, your aunt didn't want you to succeed, right? Like she didn't want what was best for you. And when I tell people this in rural places, like in the churches I've worked at and back home, people say, yeah, your aunt didn't want you to go into a lot of debt. And your aunt didn't want you to forget who you are and your family. And she knew that you could be all right. Right. And I love this because it really highlights, in fact, it highlights, I think, the difference in the way we view success and the way we view vitality, right? Because and even down to the church, right? If you're in this urban place, like you want to grow because this is the best thing. And if you're in a rural place, like the thing we value is not more people coming to our church. The thing we value is being faithful together. So I think it really, I love that. In fact, whenever I do this, people in urban places always say it's bad advice. People in rural places always say it's good advice. My closest friend in college was raised in inner city Cleveland. Yeah, I think there's a lot of socioeconomics to it too. There's just yeah, because my great aunt never had the opportunity to go to college, right? She worked as a seamstress in a mill. So I mean, it's like it was, yeah. All right. So what I want to kind of pivot to now, now that we've gotten through this story of rural, is I want to talk about the 4 strengths of what I see as a rural congregation, and then get into a little bit of metrics. And I don't want to keep you guys too late. I was told I had 5 hours. So does that feel right to everybody? All right. I was told 90 minutes to 2 hours. So that's what I'm aiming for. If we end up early, that's great. If you need to log off, just be like, please stop talking. All right. So 4 strengths. So 1, rural churches are permanent institutions, right? So they are some of the only permanent institutions in our communities. In rural places, you see hospitals closing, you see schools closing, you don't really have corporate headquarters. If you have most philanthropy stays in urban cores, so like small businesses close or come, it's all these, it's constantly moving, but churches are there. And in the church I pastored was brought into the Methodist Connection in 1789 by Francis Asbury, right? Like it was the oldest thing in that area. Number 2, like that, because they're permanent, they're also trusted. So people generally trust their churches. So in COVID, one of the studies that we actually found in rural places was we saw, and I can't remember where that study was published, but it was if pastors in rural places encourage their parishioners to get the COVID vaccine, they were more likely to get it. And if pastors in rural places discourage their parishioners to get the COVID vaccine, they were less likely to get it. And it didn't matter what the political affiliation of the congregation was. It really mattered what the pastor was saying, right? Because we trust our churches. If you go to a church and if you live in a small town and you're like, I need advice on how to start small business, you're probably going to ask the person in the pew next to you who started a small business. If you need a ride to the doctor, you're probably going to ask somebody in the congregation, right? Like you just trust the people you're going to church with. They also have a good cross section of the community in a way that almost no other organization does. So I love to walk around churches and be like, what do you do? Right? Because you see teachers and you see farmers and you see nurses and you see lawyers and small business owners and town elected officials, like all these really great things in one spot. Um, and I don't know anywhere else where you have that much expertise gathered in a place every day. I mean, I work in a university that's supposed to be a hallmark of like intelligence, right? I'm surrounded by dentists, which are great, but dentists don't know a whole lot about like being an accountant, right? Like, but my parishioners did, and I had a dentist in my church, right? So like you have all these different perspectives and all these different areas of expertise, like just mingling in a congregation. And then four, they're built around relationships. So if you want to achieve something, you're not having to like entice people there. They're doing it because they care, and they're doing it because they care about the congregation, the institution, and the people they go to church with, which means that you can do some really cool, low cost, high impact initiatives that may not even really be initiatives, right? So I remember we got together and bought a laptop for a student who was going to college because her family couldn't afford a laptop for her to go to school, right? And like the church said, this is important to us. Bought her a really nice laptop, like nicer than the laptop I had, right? Because they care. That's it. Like that was there was no question, there was no grant form, there was no like application process. It was like, this girl needs a laptop, let's do it. So when we think about vitality, I want to think about building an understanding of vitality from these key metrics, from these key strengths, sorry. And I don't want to think about participation, because participation, you'll hear me say many, many times, is a really bad metric by itself. So what participation tells us is who is sitting in a pew. That's it. Like it tells us who showed up one day. It does not tell us who is volunteering. It does not tell us what people are learning. It does not tell us what lives are being changed. It does not tell us anything. It doesn't even tell us how many people are giving, right? It just tells us that people are present. So I used to work at a small college, and it was a private school. We were tuition driven. And the joke I always had was, if you think about enrollment as participation, right? There's an easy way to boost participation at a college, like to get more students to enroll. You make it free and you give everyone an A, right? It's great, foolproof. The problem is that we would close like immediately because we would not be able to sustain any of the programs or pay any of the faculty, and the education will be worthless, right? So when I think about participation, like this is one of the ways I look at it. What, like, you have to pair participation with something else, right? So in a college, if you have high enrollment and people are dropping out all the time, you have low retention, like students aren't enjoying their time on campus, or if they're transferring there, they don't like it there, right? Like for some reason they want to leave. If you have high enrollment, but you're giving away 60% of that in scholarship, like you're financially unsustainable. You're not going to make it. If you have high enrollment, but people aren't passing their exams, right? Like if you're a nursing student and your students don't pass the nursing board exam, they're going to close your program because you're not educating students appropriately. So when you look at a vital college, you have to have steady enrollment, maybe not high enrollment, but steady enrollment. You have to have high retention. Students want to come back year after year. You have to not be giving out more discounts than you are collecting in revenue. And you have to have good post-grad opportunities, like people can go get a good job and pay their student loans, right? And it turns out you can have a vital college at 50,000, like the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. You can have a vibrant college at 5,000, like the school I went to. You can have a vibrant college and a vital college at 500. There are schools like that, right? It doesn't actually matter how many students you have as long as you have the vital infrastructure that exists. So what I want to do, and I think, yeah. So what I want to say is that thriving congregations have 3 indicators of vitality. And I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about metrics. I think metrics are something that every congregation has to figure out on their own. A lot of times and I think it's a little bit lazy of us in denominations, we depend on metrics from what we call upwards accountability, right? So there's different types of accountability. Upwards is like a store reports to the corporate headquarters, right? And they report their sales figures. And the reason they do that is because they want to see, the corporation wants to see what's going well in this particular area. So then they can drill down and say, like, this is going well, this is not going well. We've sort of internalized that and said, these are the only metrics we really need to have. That's not actually going to help us that much. So I want to look at indicators and then help congregations. And this, what I like to do with congregations is figure out, like, what are the metrics you want to measure within your own organization that you're not going to report out to anyone else. And I want to do these around three indicators. So first is theological identity. Are the people in your congregation deepening their spiritual lives? And then are they connecting it to their day-to-day realities? Number two, do you have a commitment to the community around you? You're a permanent institution. So do you understand that community? Do you understand the pain that's happened in the community? Do you understand the hope of the community? Do you see what God is doing in the community? Or are you just kind of sitting back and relying on one of these narratives that we've talked about? And then the last one is the stewardship of resources. So is the congregation, can you identify all the assets and the resources and then utilize them appropriately? And I don't mean just annual giving, not just financial resources. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I kind of want to walk through these a little bit and have some questions and let you just think about it. We don't have to share until we get to the end, but yeah. So the first one is theological identity, right? And what I mean by this is pretty simple, that you're centered around the mystery of God, that worship is connecting to the lived realities of people in your congregation. One of the great stories that I like to share is when people start talking about vocation differently. So, and like the vocation of your church and the vocation of people, you know, a lot of times people just sort of say, like, I'm a nurse because I feel, you know, I want to help people. That's great. I love that. But also, like, I remember I had a young adult in my last congregation who I really wanted her to be a youth pastor. Like, I thought she was so great at working with our youth. And I was like, Courtney, like, you love the church, you want to be a youth pastor, like, do it. And she was doing her master's in occupational therapy. And she sat down in my office one day. She's like, I like working with youth, but I'm not called to be a youth pastor. That's not my vocation. She said, I believe that we are all created in the image of God. And I am becoming an occupational therapist because I want to help people on the autism spectrum learn and live into what it means to be created in the image of God. And I'm like, that's good. You know, like, that's good theology. And I was trying to reduce her to, like, you need to be a youth pastor because that's how you live out your calling, right? So somewhere along the way, she really began to understand her theological identity. And I think one of the things we don't talk about well is vocation. We talk about it in terms of jobs. But when we talk about vocation in the small membership church, and I'm writing a book right now that'll be out, I don't know, it's a year late, so we'll see when it comes out, maybe a year or two from now. But I think this is something I borrowed from Alistair McIntyre. He's a philosopher who was at Notre Dame for a while, but he says that virtue, like, as we go towards our virtue, as we go to what we're intended to be, we need traditions, narratives, and practices. And I think this is what I mean when I talk about the theological tradition. Like, do you have the traditions that help you understand the story of who you are? And then do you have practices that are helping you live that out? Right? So when we talk about the traditions, right? Those are those things that could be formal or informal, right? We have a potluck dinner, and that's a tradition. But then are we telling a good story around that? Are we telling, like, connecting that to our theological being and saying, this is who we are because God calls us to all to sit at the same table, or this is who we are because whatever the reason is, but, like, can you connect it and ground it in your sense of theological identity? And then do you have practices for people to use and develop those skills? So, you know, if you have a person who's a Christian small business owner, hopefully, or they're a Christian and a small business owner in your church, hopefully one of the questions they're asking is, what are the traditions and practices for me as this person practicing my faith? What does it mean for me to be a small business owner in this community? What does it mean for me to be providing a living to people and being someone that people depend on, right? Yeah, I think we have to help people kind of uncover that vocation a little bit more. And that starts with really diving into that theological identity. That becomes the core and the foundation of everything. Number two is a commitment to the community. I think this starts with really just understanding the community around you. And you can do a formal asset map, you can do whatever. When I work with congregations, I have them do an asset exercise. I don't really call it a map, but sometimes I just say, like, go draw a mile radius around your congregation and show me everything within that 1 mile, right? Like, where are the cemeteries? Where are the other churches? Where are the clubs? Where do people gather? Where are the restaurants? Where's the people, like, where do people play cards on Friday nights, right? Like, what are all those places? Because those are all the things that are happening. I think you have to know both the story of what is good and bad in your congregation, and you have to be honest about it. So the place I lived previously was the birthplace of the KKK, right? It was founded literally a block from my house. And so when I would walk to church with I only had one kid then, but we would walk to church, and like, there's a plaque on the building and it's turned backwards. So they took it because they didn't want it to be like a tourist attraction for KKK people. So they turned it and so that you can't read the plaque. And so it's kind of a signifier of, like, we've turned our back on this history, or this legacy. And I'm having to, like, explain this to my daughter, right? And so the congregation likes to tell a story about how one time we stood up to the KKK, and that's fantastic. That's true. And we like to tell a story about how, like, the college started in the basement of the church, and that's true, and that's great. It's also true that the person who helped found that church was one of the founding members of the KKK, right? That's part of our legacy. And we need to be able to tell both how that impacts us today, as well as the good stuff. It can't just be one or the other. We need to know the full story. I think we have to be a people who embrace hospitality. And I don't just mean, like, being nice to people when they show up, but really embracing hospitality with all the organizations in our community. Are we willing to partner with people? Are we willing to show up for other organizations? Are we willing to let people use our assets as they need to? So, one day I remember all these cyclists used to go by my church, and we had a water thing in the front, like, water hose kind of thing. And I remember where one guy wanted to put a lock on it because he saw, like, 5 cyclists stop and they filled up their water bottles. And I'm like, we can spend the $2 that cost us in water. Like, it's a good ministry, right? Like, let's put a toolkit for the cyclists to, like, fix their bikes, So are we doing that? Are we actually, like, cultivating that hospitality? And then are we cultivating leaders within both the congregation and the community? So are we identifying talent as we see it around us? And are we identifying opportunities for other partnerships outside of our congregation? And that gets us into this stewardship of resources, right? So a lot of times when we think about resources and stewardship, we talk about, like, paying our bills and keeping the lights open, or keeping the doors open and keeping the lights on. And I think that's great. Like, got to pay your bills. Good thing. But also, we need stewardship that understands the mission. And I want you to hear me say this: reorganizing a church, like moving from a full-time pastor to a part-time pastor, or moving from, like, in the Methodist Church, we have 2-point charges, right? Where, we'll have one pastor serving multiple churches, or having a bivocational pastor if it's done well. Reorganizing your church to make the most use of your congregation is not a bad thing. It's a faithful thing, because it's looking at what we actually have in the mission and making sure those two things align. It also requires us to really recognize what's happening around us. So one of the things I often hear is that, we want to do X ministry. And so a church will launch a ministry, a food pantry, but there's 9 food pantries around them and they've never talked to them. And they've never volunteered with them. And then, I also hear a lot of, like, well, my congregation doesn't want to come to this, or my laity don't want to participate in this. But we don't really look at, where are our laity already volunteering in our communities? Where are they showing up? What are they doing? So if there's one metric that I wish every church in America would add, or in the world, it would be, where, like, an annual survey of where your people volunteered every year, right? Like, just where did your people volunteer? Who volunteered outside of the church and where? And then you can go to those organizations and be like, you know, Jane has been volunteering here for 5 years. We would really love to hear more about your mission, right? That's understanding that you have a natural bridge to another partner and an interest from one of your parishioners, right? Do we understand those resources? And then even if we're just talking about money, do we understand like in-kind donations, right? I mean, so people, whenever we do an event, we get in-kind donors, and we have to give them like the tax write-off because they cooked a bunch of food for us. If you think about like how much money it would cost to put on every potluck, if you had to pay for all the services, like pay for that catering, right? Are you thanking people for doing that work? Are you thanking the people who like clean your church sanctuary to save you $300? And I mean, like, really, like, there are people who are giving thousands and thousands of dollars of time, and we never acknowledge it because we're like, oh, that's your duty. And it is part of our responsibility to the church, but we don't look at it as a resource. We just sort of look at it as like, oh, that's just another thing that happens. All right. So if you have these strengths of the rural church and you have these indicators of vitality, I like to think of this as an equation, right? So these strengths plus these indicators of vitality leads you to what I think is a new definition of evangelism, right? Because I think this sets up the church as an actual institution, an anchor institution in your community, as a place of what I like to call community transformation. And this is a work of evangelism. So I like to say that we need to reconsider what evangelism is. And I label it like this. So here's my definition. You can like it or not. But I say evangelism is community engagement, is the practice of recognizing, cultivating, announcing, and inviting the wider community to participate in the kingdom of God. And so for recognizing the kingdom of God, we're talking about, this is just believing that God already is at work in our communities, right? Where is God at work in the community around us? What's the story? What are the resources? Where is the work already happening? Right? Because sometimes we get into this idea that like we're going to be the first ones to start it, or that God is only showing up in our specific congregation. And what I want to say is like, no, Jane, who volunteers at whatever, knows that God is showing up there. Like that's why she's volunteering there, right? Because she believes that she has a commitment to that place because of her faithfulness. So where is God showing up? Can you recognize it? Can you name it? Can your congregation name it? Cultivating that. So when we talk about cultivating, you can think about this like in the agrarian sense. I like to think about it in terms of like friendship. So the thing I learned when I became an adult is that making friends as an adult is hard. And that may sound really funny. Most people agree with me on this. But there's this really awkward point when you start making friends where you're like, especially when you move to a new city, you're like, you'll start texting. I mean, this is me, my generation, right? You like start texting, maybe you'll go have coffee, you might have dinner, you go hang out, like your kids do a play date. And then over time, like you become friends, right? And then eventually you just kind of look back and you're like, oh man, we actually are friends now. If you walked up to somebody the first time you met them and you said like, hey, when's your birthday? I'm coming to your birthday party. Also, do you want to come to Christmas with me? It'd be kind of weird, right? But that is what churches do a lot of times to other organizations. We show up and we're like, hey, by the way, we're this church. Like, can we lead a thing that you're doing better than we are, right? Can we lead this food ministry that you're already doing exceptionally well? Instead of taking the time to actually get to know what's happening, right? So we look at these resources and we don't immediately assume that there's work for us to do. We know that there is going to be work down the road, but what work needs to be done? Not the work we want to do necessarily, but what work really needs to happen? Where are we called to pitch in? And what's hard is that this might mean the church is not leading it, that we might be serving it instead. One of the things I like to recommend that pastors do is 100 pointless cups of coffee, and you can pick your time frame for this. Call a nonprofit leader in your congregation, or like the hospital CEO or a teacher, principal, whatever. Go have a pointless cup of coffee with them and just sit for an hour and listen. And then do it again another day. You don't have any agenda. You're not trying to get anything out of them. You're not trying to raise money. Some of my best partnerships as a nonprofit leader, as a pastor, came from pointless cups of coffee, where I just got coffee with these people, and over time we decided, oh, actually we have these things in common. And I'll tell you, like, I still do it in my current job at the College of Dentistry, because I have to work closely with a bunch of different people and a bunch of different like associate deans. And I have found that the easiest way for me to get on their good side is to take them to a pointless cup of coffee where I don't ask them about any work projects. I don't demand anything from them. I just sit down and listen to them. Right. And then all of a sudden, like, we have a good relationship over time. And you just kind of look back and you're like, oh, hey, there it is. So then we start thinking about announcing the kingdom of God. Right. And this is really a question of, how is your work different because you follow Jesus Christ? And this goes back to that theological identity. How are you different from the secular nonprofit food pantry? How are you different from this other literacy program that exists in your community? How are you different from the workforce development initiative, right? And I don't mean that like you have to become like the street preacher or something, but just internally, how are you thinking about this? And then what kind of practices are you starting to glean through your work? So I like to tell this story of I think I'm telling the story in the right spot, but I'm gonna go ahead and tell it. So I went to this dinner one time, and we were doing this rural urban divide thing, and we had a bunch of people sitting around a table, and we were like urban leaders, pastors from rural places, all these different groups, and we started by talking about. So first we had dinner, and then we started a conversation, and what we started talking about was all the things that are hard about the relationship between rural urban places in our specific region. And you have these things like, the people in the city owned all the manufacturing plants in the rural area, and like the CEO of that major plant was there. And so all the management jobs were going to people who lived in the urban area and then commuted to the rural place, right? And all the line workers, people on the manufacturing line, lived in the rural community. They had a lot lower wages, right? And there was this really great moment where the guy said, we can start more leadership development programs for this. And one of I think it was a school and then a church, both said, you can do it at our church, right? You'll do it in our fellowship hall because people feel comfortable going there. And what you saw in this is a practice of communion, right? We're all going to gather around a common table. You're going to have a time of confession where you say, here's what I've not been doing well. I've not been giving people in this community opportunities to grow. I'm going to repent of that. I'm going to come up with a solution and try to figure out a new way to move forward. And then the hospitality of saying, like, we're going to do this work together. We're in this together. Can your congregation identify that that's happening? Can you go out into the world and say, this is a moment of repentance. This is a moment of gratitude. This is a practice of hospitality. That's all this really is. And then inviting people to participate in the kingdom of God. So I believe wholeheartedly that the kingdom of God is not just a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual reality, yes, but it's also economic, it's also ethical, it's social, it has all these different realities. And, I love when Jesus feeds the 5,000. It's not just that Jesus fed all the people and made them not hungry anymore. It's that Jesus said, look, it doesn't have to be like this, right? Like, this little kid shared. And so there's enough. And Jesus is saying, like, this is what the world should be. This is what the kingdom of God looks like, right? And that's ethical, that's economic, that's about like the needs. It's not just like a community service project. It's really pointing and saying, you all are welcome to live in this reality. You all are welcome to be part of the kingdom of God in all the different versions that exist, like however, all these different realities. So William Abraham talks about like initiating people into the kingdom of God and how that's it's theological, it's intellectual, it's spiritual, it's about like the habits of our life. Does our work allow for that? And again, it's not about getting people to show up to church on Sunday, but it's about helping people when they say like, why are you doing this? Well, because I believe this is what the kingdom of God should look like. I believe that the kingdom of God should be a place where people have this, or people have opportunity, or people have a vocation, right? I believe that the kingdom of God is a place that provides that. So I'm going to tell you a quick story and then I'll end it. and we can have some time for questions and comments. And, you know, if you think I've said something really dumb, you're welcome to raise the point. This is my friend Tim's church. He is a pastor in Gainesboro, Tennessee, which Gainesboro, last time I checked, had a population of 962. So huge metropolitan area, right? And his church has an average worship attendance of around 55, I think. And then it's got a high poverty rate. So 49% of the students under the age of 18 were below the poverty line. Most of the high school students are not going to college. So I did a cohort with Tim. He was in my very first cohort that I ever did with pastors. And I did like this thing where they have to do assets, right? They have to name the assets. And Tim says that his assets in his community are a bunch of angry contractors. Asset number one, angry contractors. Asset number two was a bunch of kids that didn't know how to swing a hammer. So that's great. And then number three is a shell of a building. And I'm looking at Tim like, my dude, I don't know that you understood the assignment. Like angry people that don't know how to swing a hammer, and a building that you can't use are not really assets in my view, right? So Tim comes back and he's like, no, I have a plan. So his plan was this. He's going to get all these kids who don't know how to swing a hammer. They're hanging around with his son because his son is like in high school. And so they're always like hanging around his house. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to start a thing for them on Thursday nights. And it's not explicitly going to be religious, but it's going to be religious enough. And so like they're going to do devotions. They do some, mentorship stuff. So then he's like, and all these contractors who are angry because these kids don't know how to swing a hammer, they're going to come be the mentors. And they're going to practice all these skills on this building that we can't use. And so every week in Gainesboro, Tennessee, there's a group of mentors teaching job skills to young adults as they rebuild a building for the church for free, right? And this became the county's major workforce development, to the point that the county was funding this at like $7,000 a year, which really paid for the supplies because there's no employees, there's no labor. I mean, like there's just volunteers showing up. And what's great is we know that kids need mentors that are not their teachers or their parents, right? Like that's one of the keys for social success. In a small town, like if you don't have the skills and you're not going to college, it really helps to have a mentor to teach you those skills that can look out for you, right? And then these people, these contractors who need employees, all of a sudden have them, right? Because they're training them themselves. It's a really cool thing. And so Tim, if you look at this, like really understood the strengths of his congregation, right? So he knew that they were, my boss is here. He just walked by. So he knew, I don't know why he's here. So Tim knew like, okay, look, our congregation is probably the only group in this community that can do this. We're central, right? Everyone knows where we are. People trust us. We're relational. We have these strengths, right? Like we can pull this together. We have a good cross section of our congregation to do it. And then he understood these core indicators of vitality. So he knew that what their theological identity was, right? We're a place that's going to cultivate vocation. We're going to be a place where we are committed to the community. And you saw that play out, right? And we're going to be a place that honors all these different resources, even if they're not financial. So the skills of the people, the passion of the people, right? Because one of the assets he named was their anger in particular. Like they're frustrated. He's using that as an asset. And then the people's inability, the kids' inability to swing a hammer, right? That's another asset. He puts all this together and he comes up with this thing that is both a tool. Like I think he at one point had like 30 kids there or something every week, right before COVID. And it's just cool to see like this mentorship program that is it is spiritually based. It is a theological thing. And my favorite part was Tim said, I finally figured out like the church can really be the center of transformation for this community. Like it's going to have to come through the church. No other organization is going to do it. And I think even with 55 members, like that is what a vital congregation looks like, right? All right, so here's my last pitch to you. If you don't hear anything else I've said tonight, or you want to ignore everything I've said tonight, here's my final thing to you. Please do not try to be a large suburban church. Like, we just function differently. Embrace the ways we're different. Understand those very particular strengths of your congregation. Figure out what those are, and then don't hide from them, right? Like, just full on embrace them. Allow those strengths to shape how you're thinking about vitality in your particular area. So you have these indicators, but what do these strengths show you about the metrics that you should be using, how you should be measuring and setting goals for that vitality? Please know that you are leaders in your communities, and you might be the only permanent institution. You might be the only option for a lot of the communities that you serve. Like, you're not only a place for people to gather, you speak into the community and people trust you. And know that you get to help to shape the story of your community. You're probably one of the most powerful people that gets to shape that, one of the most powerful entities that gets to shape that. And that's both the lament and the opportunities. So if your church is telling a story of lament and death and decay, then that's what people outside of your congregation are going to hear as well. If your church is telling a story of opportunity, then that's what people are going to hear. I remember once we were up in a small town in North Carolina, and the county planner, we were all gathered in a church fellowship hall, and she was like, I hear pessimism so much. You people in the church, you don't have the luxury of pessimism. And it is a luxury to be pessimistic all the time. But we are people of hope. So your church should help shape that story as well. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions and comments and ideas and criticisms and all those great things. I always put this pitch out here. No one ever takes me up on it. But if you have a really cool story about something your congregation is doing, or you just want to talk, send me an email. I use my Ozark stuff for my church work because I work for a state agency, so that gets kind of complicated. But email me at astanton@ozarks.edu. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what sort of things your congregations are doing. Nothing is too big or too small. Like, I love the stories of, like, we're the only place where there's a tornado shelter in my community, right? Like, those are great stories. And if I really, like, seriously, there's a lot of this. And if I like it, I borrow a lot of these stories and kind of share them in different publications. So I would love to tell your story and help you tell your story. Not to take credit for it, but I want people to know what churches are doing. So send me an email. I'm also happy just to chat anytime. You can follow me on Twitter or whatever it's called now, and on Threads. I don't tweet that much anymore, but yeah, I'm there. I talk about my kids mostly and sports, but occasionally I have really ill-formed opinions that I share. So always happy to talk. And now I want to hear from you if we have a little bit of time. What do you think? What questions do you have? You're welcome to unmute yourself, ask away. Jim, I saw you unmute. That means you got to
Yeah,
go first.
I guess, I was just curious, one of the things that we're seeing in our small rural community, we're situated between Lincoln and Omaha, and people are actually generally looking for housing in our community that are trying to get out of the big urban centers. But again, I'm appreciating some of the things that you're saying about coming alongside people and just, what gifts can we look at that we have as a church to maybe that we can just come alongside some of these new people moving into our community, and it really resonated with me about people our age that are looking for a nice quiet place to retire in. So yeah, I don't think we really focused on that as a congregation. So.
Which is always fascinating to me, because, like, a lot of rural economic development people are like, hey, we need to focus on entrepreneurship for recent retirees because they don't want to be done. They just want to be done with, like, this part of their career. And I'm like, I'm always a little miffed when like economic development agencies figure something out about theology, about, like, vocation before the church has really grasped it. And I'm like, oh man, you're saying that our lives are not over yet? Like,
Yeah, right.
crazy.
Yeah.
This is a question for the group. Sorry, you said you were near Lincoln. Do any of y'all follow Nebraska volleyball up in your part of the world?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so my wife was a college volleyball player. We watch a lot of Nebraska volleyball, and I have a Bergen Riley hoodie that I wear.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. big Nebraska volleyball fan. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we're very proud of the Memorial Stadium volleyball game that happened. this
Yeah.
year.
One of my best friends is a Wisconsin volleyball fan, and so we are inviting her to stay with us the week of the Wisconsin-Nebraska game, and I'm super pumped because I'm gonna pop out that hoodie, and yeah, it's gonna be great.
Yeah.
All right.
Great, thank you.
Sorry. Can I stop the screen sharing? I think I did. I think there might be a slight delay. All right. And yeah, I saw a couple people ask about provide the slides. I'm happy to share the slides. And if you're ever doing like a weeknight thing and you want me to zoom in and have a conversation with your people, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, just shoot me an email. But I'll email my slides to either Alan or Chris or that group, and trust that y'all can get them out. That's okay. I will say I don't take all my notes out, so if my notes don't make sense in the bottom, then sorry.
So Alan, one of the things I'd like to reflect on is a lot of what you talk about is relationship building.
Yeah.
And not trying to use pro forma gimmick. I came into my church here in Cleveland at the height of the worship wars, where there were so many books out about using screens and not wearing a robe and just all these things that if you didn't do, you were destined to die. And some of those things were important and some of them weren't, and it was about being organic. So I definitely get it. Whatever congregation you're serving or you're trying to help, building a relationship with the people in the congregation. And I also heard you talk about building relationships with the community around. What I'm worried about now, and this is probably more me as a regional minister, that is I'm going into congregations that don't feel they have the luxury of that time anymore.
Yeah.
They're feeling very anxious, and I can say you should have been building those relationships with your community all along, but that's just a little too shaming and not really helpful.
Right.
But I do say I think that that's the way to go. It's a long-term endeavor, and they kind of look at me and go, I don't know if we have a long time to build relationships. So what would you say to that? And am I right?
Yeah, I think there's a fear of a lot of churches. So I'm working with a church right now it's a small church in Arkansas, about an hour away from me. And the first thing I try to say is we talk a lot about like aspirational goals versus actual goals, right? Like what are the things that you say that you want to be doing versus what are the things that you say that you are doing, right? So aspirational goals are always sort of like we want to be a welcoming, hospitable church. And then the actual goal is like we don't want to die. Like that's, and you're spending all your time. So, and the way I do that is like, okay, what do you talk about in a business meeting? What do you talk about after church? And they're like, how do we not die? Right. And that's your actual goal. And so one of the things is getting to recognize, okay, if this is our actual goal, what is it about avoiding death that we're super afraid of? Is it closing? Are we really worried about closing? Because that's, okay. Are we worried that we're not going to grow anymore? Is that what we're talking about? So it's kind of getting down to an understanding of like, what are we actually afraid of? Because not being a vital church is something that is so amorphous, right? People look at it and say like, we don't have a youth, so we're not vital. Okay, is that something worth being afraid of? So really distilling down like the definition of what we're talking about. And then reminding them, okay, if you decide to reorient how you're using your resources, does that mean you're failing? Not usually. I mean, it might. Like if you, if you decide you want to reorient all your resources to like NASCAR, okay, that's probably not going to help your church grow. Or that's probably not going to help your church do anything that you should be doing. But does that mean if you switch from, a full-time pastor to a lay servant who's leading your church faithfully, and the denomination has to step up and support that somehow, does that mean that you're dying? No. Like that just means that we have to move into this next phase of our vocation. So I think it's really about like, how do we articulate what that phase of vocation is? And then for the denominational leaders in the group, I think one of the challenges is there is a sustainability component to this, right? So at least, like I'm United Methodist, like I said, and the annual conference is always worried about like, are these churches going to support the long-term work of it? Like, is the annual conference going to go away? Is the denomination going to go away? Who's going to provide these resources? And so I would also say to the annual conferences, like, I don't know that we have a good grasp on this yet. Like the denominations don't have a good grasp on it. So I think we still have to figure out what our vocation is as a organization. Are we here to support and empower these churches to figure out their vocations? Are we here to support them as they launch new programs? Are we okay if churches don't launch programs and just, do something that's we can't really measure except for stories? So that's a long-winded way of saying I think it comes down to like really trying to get at what those fears are, and then figuring out how we support what we want our actual goal to be. I don't know if any of that made sense, but hopefully.
Yeah, yes, it did. Yes, it
Okay.
did. And I really appreciate Heather's comment in the chat.
Yeah. Dating the community can be fun. There's some like weird things you learn about your community that like no one ever tells you. And I think those are the most fun things when you like go to lunch with somebody that's been in there for a long time. Like there was they built a lake near my church, but before that there was like a train track that ran through the center of what now is a lake, and like they would have elephants loading and unloading it, and I'm like, that's crazy. Yeah, anyway, sorry. Just being a place where like people can deposit that information is really fun.
Alan, when you talked about stories just a minute ago, you mentioned triggered in my mind Tech Samples book about the oral culture.
Yeah.
And I think when I first read that, I was serving a church in Frankton, Indiana, tiny little town outside of Anderson, Indiana. And that was a real eye opener for me, coming out of pretty upper middle class family, blah, blah, blah. Reading was real important. Writing, all of that was heavy emphasis. Have you played much around the distinction between the different kinds of ways that we communicate and what that looks like in rural communities and how that plays out with where I really want to go with that is a relationship building.
Yeah.
Because stories become really, at least from my experience, they become really important. Just wondered if you played around with that.
I'm gonna see real quick if I have this other slide up from another earlier, like recently that I did, because it's really I try to capture this like in a thought one day where I was like, what does this actually mean? Hold on. And if I can't find it in like the next 30 seconds, I won't show it. But I think, and maybe this gets to what you're talking about, maybe not. Is it? Nope. Oh yeah, here it is. All right, so I'm gonna share this. So one of the things I like to talk about is a lot of times when we think about churches, we think about like a top-down model, right? You have your pastor, then you have your staff. Rural small membership churches are more like this kind of spider web. So you have your pastor in the middle, and then all these other things are connected to that, right? So you have like your finance chair who is best friends with the grumpy person, and they're friends with my great grandmother started this church, and then for whatever reason, like they all got to know the too much energy person. Like y'all know that person who has way too much energy for anything, and you're like, can you chill? And then there's that random new member that like people were like, hey, do you want to be on this committee? And like they're overloaded immediately. And so what happens is in our heads as pastors, we're always like, hey, we can organize all this in a meeting, right? And what really happens is you have to figure out who's talking to who and also be talking to all of them as well. And who's talking through you to someone else, and who do you need to be talking to get someone else to weigh in on something, right? And so the majority of work begins to happen not in a meeting or not in the worship service, but in like coffee or lunch after church. Like I can't tell you how many times things got decided by I finally just went to the grumpy person's house and I was like, yo, what's up? Right? Like, why are we doing this? You know? And all of a sudden it was like, okay, well, I'll tell my friend the finance chair to back off. And I'm like, great, thank you. Right? Like it's not rocket science. It's just, yeah. I don't know if that answers the question or if Chris liked it. And so I think he left.
I don't know where he went.
Well,
But hey, Paul, you got something?
Sure. Hello. Sorry, another regional perspective. But as regional minister, I deal with struggling urban churches as I
Yeah.
deal with struggling rural churches. And I would love, and I believe one way to address that is through intersectionality.
Mhm.